because I believe science might offer an answer to the curse of the Bambino.
Why someone took so long to hire that guy is beyond me. Anybody who's not tearing their team down right now and rebuilding it using your model, they're dinosaurs. One of the great things about money is it buys a lot of things. One of which is the luxury to disregard what baseball likes, doesn't like, what baseball thinks, doesn't think. This is threatening, not just a way of doing business, but in their minds, it's threatening the game.
How can you not be romantic about baseball?
All right, welcome to another Baseball Ops podcast with TopV. We're going back in again, guys. Going back in to overload high-intent weighted baseball training. I know a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but why do I do this, guys? I do it because it's very educational on the aspects of player development. There's an underlying theme here of how do we develop players, and that's really why I really enjoy this topic. And on the top of that, it really exploits, unfortunately, how misled and flawed baseball is because of the popularity of still high-intent weighted baseball training. I say it's gone down since I've started pounding the pavement about the issues behind it. And this is just really the icing on the cake or the nail in the coffin here, showing that we have a plethora of knowledge now of what's going on. And basically all the fears that we've had or all the concerns I've had are definitely true. So, but I'm going to leave it up to you. You listen to this. This is Alex, Dr. Manga here. I introduce him. He's a very smart mind and very involved in the research behind the issues or the injuries behind high-intent weighted baseball training or overload training. So it runs pretty long, so let's just jump into it, and I hope you get value out of it. Here we go. All right, Brent Porcio here, another exceptional guest. Really excited to interview, and we're going to have some another controversial topic we're going to get into, which has been talked a lot about on Top Velocity, but some really revolutionary information. We have a revolutionary mind here with Alex Manga, who's currently a professor at Ferris State University for business strategy and has a PhD in evaluation research and measurement. Thanks, Alex, for being on the show. I appreciate it. Or should I call you doctor?
No. Glad to be here. Thank you very much for having me on, Brent.
Yeah, I'm fired up. Met you through Rich Dunno, who's everyone knows is the king of the hill. Great guy. So appreciate him bringing us together on this. And you were a baseball player, weren't you?
Yeah. So I played in Southeast Michigan at a Class B high school, and then went to Ferris State, where I played on a team for a couple of years. Had a great opportunity there. Left and then went on to get an opportunity to play a little bit of affiliated ball for about, maybe 4 months until my arm was shot. I mean, my arm was pretty much shot before I got out of high school from overuse. I was a lefty that was throwing, near 80 in high school, but threw a lot of curveballs, a lot of sliders, and so it was pretty destroyed by the time I even got into. So you were a thumber? Yeah, for sure. Can I tell a little story about that?
Yeah.
So Rich and I actually met when we both did Tom House's program together, and I made the mistake on the second day of showing one of his USC students what I knew about throwing a curveball, which obviously we know 2/3 of America is still throwing it. And man, out of all these guys that were there, 30 guys, and there was Nolan Ryan's there. There's a couple of big names there. Wow. I get called out at lunch.
What?
And I'm thinking, what? What did I do? Well, we just want to, bring you to a different level of understanding on an effective way to throw a curve without ripping up your arm. And so right then they got into that conversation about a karate chop curve. And man, I tell you, I got almost emotional about it, not in an anger sense, but the other direction, because that's what ripped up my arm, literally.
Well,
But I didn't
yeah.
know there was an alternative.
And you probably threw it for many, many, many years.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many buckets of buffering I was taking in the 80s to try and get through a game.
I know. I can't believe Nolan Ryan did those Advil commercials. That's probably why I took so much of it too.
Who better, right?
Well, if it worked for him, right?
Right.
Well, good, man. Well, great background with baseball. I think that's something we both share in common. Your PhD is really impressive. Evaluation, research, measurement. Talk about what that means and how hard that was to get.
So, Western Michigan University, this cool little place in Kalamazoo, which is really the home of Elvis, because he spent more time there designing Gibson guitars than anybody else. But Western Michigan is the home of I think it's one of the only programs in America that offers a PhD in interdisciplinary evaluation and measurement and research. And what the whole focus originally was for these graduates to go and provide program evaluation for the government, but they changed the program. So let's talk about it for a second. So you can't just evaluate a program by assessment and saying, okay, yeah, it's kind of, it appears to be doing what it's supposed to do. When we do evaluation and measurement, we're actually figuring out through statistics and data and comparisons and standards whether this is actually doing what it's supposed to do instead of just it's functioning the way it was designed. Is it effective? Does it have an effect size that is recognizably coherent and showing that it can do what it's supposed to do? So instead of limiting it to government programs, they said, hey, people in business would like to learn this, or people in other sciences would like to learn these techniques. And having an MBA and a business background, I thought this was perfect for my consulting roles that I was, doing at the time. So I got into the program, and I thought, honestly, well, this isn't going to be that difficult. These people are as strict and retentive as it could possibly get about being perfect with all your work. So, yeah, it took me 3 years of coursework and another 2 years to write my dissertation. The dissertation is 340 pages long, and it was fun. So, yeah, it was very good and effective on evaluating anything and using measurement science to determine if this is what you should be doing.
That's brilliant. So we really like where we're going with this. So we got a ex-minor league ball player who destroyed his arm, and we have a PhD in basically someone who could figure out why to the point of why he destroyed his arm. So did you ever put those two together? Did you ever say, okay, I want to take this knowledge and this degree that I have in research and evaluation and measurement, and I want to try to figure out why I tore myself up in baseball? Did it ever go in that direction, or just a little bit?
No, so when you're doing your coursework, you're trying to fall back on things that and you're also practicing the models of evaluation. So actually, pitching was one of the things that I jumped into. And so back at that point, I was doing the same thing everybody else was doing. I was looking at the biomechanics of the pitching process, and I was looking at what I was being taught by House and saying, okay, how do these domains interact? And trying to determine where people were going wrong in terms of losing their own nerves and having to have Tommy John. So at that point, in that particular process, we'd all kind of come to the same conclusion that a lot of it was A, technique, and B, overuse. So back when I was doing that, I was taking a lot of ASMI's numbers and putting them into different statistical frames and doing what we call meta-analysis. And so I was getting effect sizes on different things that were measured to determine if we all had the same idea, if this was pointing a direction regressively. So, in statistics, when you're doing correlations and things, it can be confounding because the correlations don't always tell you what direction things are actually pointing. They actually just tell you have a relationship. Let me give you the best one that we can all wrap our heads around. The ACT-SAT does not point a direction of whether a student will be successful in his first year of college. It says there's a strong relationship between higher scores and students that are successful in college. That's it. But it doesn't say that we don't know which one's going which way. Well, same thing with a lot of the data that we were getting. So what it means on paper, it looks like somebody took a bunch of sand and threw it at a paper blot, right? And so we didn't get the linearity we were looking for on a lot of that meta-analysis, which really made me scratch my head. Which one is causing the problem?
I want to tell the audience what meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is just basically a conglomerate of research, like pulling a lot of research together and then looking at it from a big picture. How is all this research working together? Are we finding correlations across, through this evidence? Is that correct?
Yeah, you're heading in the right direction. What we have to do in a meta-analysis is we have to decide what our goal could be with it. Do we want to find a strong effect size in predictors or in correlations or in means? What are we going to do with that information? So I was looking for predictors. I was looking for regressive relationships. So that means when I went looking for the data, I had to try and pick up all data that was predictory, something that was causing this to happen. So there was a regressive inference made. And I picked up, I don't know, it was 30 of them. Went through. Now, I didn't publish this because here's the problem with the way I did it. It was strictly laboratory. But you need to have one or two different people working on it at the same time. And you have to have what we call raters with rules. So in other words, just a guy like me picking something like this up and saying that, okay, this meta-analysis does or doesn't show something isn't very ethical because I could have stacked the deck, right? So you need two or three people doing it and you have rules of how you're going to include these studies, right? So I didn't do any of that because I was doing it in a laboratory. So I went through all this. I grabbed as much as I could. I wasn't being picky. I just grabbed anything I could off ASMI and plugged and played it into the programs that we have. And we learned a little bit. The biggest thing was the one that had an extraordinarily strong effect size was overuse, right? Mm-hmm. So my presentation, I think, at that point for the evaluation segment was on pitchers that are overusing their arms.
Which is really common today. So it kind of takes us to the state of the union of baseball today. What would you say our biggest problems are in baseball? Obviously, overuse is one. All the way up the ranks. I mean, is this obviously something that you find is a problem all the way up the ranks? Why is overuse a problem? Do you have any opinions or information on that? And let's go in this direction.
Well, I mean, in general terms, a lot has changed. I mean, the environment, when I talked to you when we first met, the entire environment's changed from 20 years ago of how we're prepping our pitchers, how pitchers are prepping themselves, the different training techniques that they're using, from either weights to long toss to overload training, to how much they're playing. even here in Michigan, where we have 4 seasons, we're watching kids play baseball almost year round. I mean, we're talking about kids that are playing the high school season, then a short summer season, then a fall season. And then they're going right back in the gym in winter and running with some program, whether it's a velocity program or just a training program in general. So the arm's not getting a lot of rest. Okay, and here's how I got into the game here. A couple gentlemen found out that I did some research with Rich, some basic literature review more than anything else, and said, hey, we like what you wrote, we like what you're saying and your approach. Can you produce, a model for us, an evaluation model? And I said, I don't know, maybe. Let's experiment with it. So the first iteration at this was taking a look at the biomechanics that people were using and just running a ton of data and statistics on it. It's kind of taking the information that you get with your work and then throwing it into some serious regression and saying, hey, odds are, based on what we see with this group of people over here that have failed with bad arms, when we line these numbers up and we run correlations and t-tests, these are alike, these are different. That worked pretty good. But we knew that there was more that we could get. So we actually started digging a little bit deeper to get a more, bioscience look at what actually is happening with our athletes internally. So I sat down with a doctor at U of M hospital, and she's just a phenomenal research scientist, MD is what she is. And I said, the orthopedics have a group of tools that they use to measure and to analyze and to try and develop, some synthesized version of what took place or can take place. But my instincts tell me that this is only part of the story. And she said, that's really funny you're saying that, because we were just having this conversation. It's not, it's the orthopedics, it's the trainers, it's the sports docs in general. They are really good at what they know and good at fixing things. They're good at wrapping their heads around what they can see. Unfortunately, they're not using every tool possible. That, her perspective was that they're not using all the tools. And so we began to discuss different options and opportunities for people to apply to athletes and what they're actually doing on the Olympics, the Olympic committees with some of the running athletes. So she gave me about 4 different techniques that were bloodborne. So I'll tell you that. I am strapped with an NDA, like I told you, but I can go so far. I had a conversation yesterday. So when we look at hormones in blood, we can tell a lot of things about what's going on internally. And these can be after the fact, or these can be before, okay? So let me give you some examples. When somebody has a heart attack, it sparks a hormone in your body, and it takes a hospital about 10 minutes to figure out if that hormone's present to know if you had a heart attack. For example, my father had a heart attack in '96, but we didn't know. He was walking around with this thing. Hospitalized him because his EKG didn't look quite right. They did a blood test and said he had a mild heart attack because of this hormone. And so there's a couple markers in the bloodstream that we can use to measure certain things relative to muscle injury or stress. There's other things that are happening today that I can't share with you because they are proprietary, but other markers that we can use and techniques to measure to say you are clearly breaking down the products inside your arm, the muscle, the tendons, etc. And you're doing it at this rate. And you're doing it to this degree. And the problem with the tendons and ligaments and things is that they're not repairable. They don't just like repair. So this has been very interesting. So we ran a good pilot study this winter and learned quite a bit about what overload training is doing compared to a control group that was just doing the standard, training program that I think that most D2 colleges or D3 or D1 are doing.
So at this point, like a little summary. So you started to look more into factors that were defining or measuring overuse, which led you into the blood work, right?
Right.
Because obviously, like you said, that's a big correlation to injury is overuse. And so now you've gone into doing research into a popular form of training, which I like to look at it as an extreme form of training, which is overload training, specifically at a high intent where it makes it extreme, because that more than likely could tell you a lot about what overuse is doing to the arm, or is it something that contributes to overuse? Is that why you looked into overload training?
Well, it's so when you're doing evaluation and research, you're looking at what the current problem is in the industry, right? So the problems in the industry are pretty clear. One, you've got team owners with, I don't know how many pitchers in their systems. I'm guessing it's 60 to 80. At one point, I heard 60 to 80. I had heard it costs $1 million to bring a pitcher up to the bump by the time they're done with AAA and they get there. That's a lot of money that these owners are putting out. I don't know if that's factual. This is what I've heard, so I'll caveat it. But if that's the case, we look back at 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and the spike in Tommy John during 14 and 15, and try to figure out, wow, what actually is causing this big spike? Now, it appears it may have come down, but I'm not sure because nobody truly has data that is lining up with anybody's data. So MLB.com has some data. Hospitals have data. We don't know for sure, but we know everybody's agreeing it peaked in 14. So all of this occurred where we had the TJs peaking. We looked at what changed in the industry. We know that a lot of athletes that were in the system between minor league and major league had been playing in more than one season. They've been playing in 2 to 3. Okay. So there's your overuse, just by speculation.
Also too, to add, this is the wave of kids that were more than likely the first wave of the year-round travel ball guys.
Right. Exactly. So it's fairly safe to assume that one of the key contributors there could have been overuse. Then we're seeing the overload training as another moderator here, and people that are paying the bills are saying, wow, what risk factors are ahead of us at this point when we're floating this many pitchers and paying this much money? And the average right now on a pitcher getting through, as a pro is 5 years, 6 years, right? So that's like the average. That's not a lot of return on your investment, right? So this is the problem.
What do you think of this? I think this is how we got here. So the game, like you said, changed 20 years ago, and more than likely it's because we went to we shortened the amount of innings a starter would throw on average. We went from 7 to maybe 5 to 6 now. So and if you go back past 20 years, we went 9, to 5 or 6 now. So what you just did is you took an athlete that was enduring a lot of pitches to now not having to endure as many pitches. So you changed the composition really of the pitcher. You made him a more anaerobic athlete because now he doesn't have to throw as much. So when you do that, because he can be more anaerobic, he can now be more powerful. He can put more effort into those pitches because there's less of them. And they didn't really change the recovery times. I mean, the Rays are trying to go to a 4-man rotation, but we brought down the innings and we actually kept the 5-day rotation. So it allowed them to throw harder, which is more effective. So, and then we have these other pitchers who are short relievers, closers. Same thing. They're not throwing a lot of innings, and they can be more anaerobic, more powerful. So now we bring in more trauma, right? So there is trauma through endurance, but there's also a different type of trauma through intent, and ultimately that leads to injury. And that's probably when the injury rate started to climb, is when we changed the pitcher into that anaerobic pitcher. And then on top of that, we, in the youth ranks at the young ages, we started promoting them to throw more often, and then at the same time trying to throw harder. And it's just the perfect storm at this point, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. So you're right on cue. Here's one of the problems. 1995. Let's just go back there for a second. 1995. Team owners, docs, trainers, they knew how to scale the predictability of an athlete. They knew how to, wrap their mind around what they can reasonably expect out of each athlete that they were bringing through the system, based on nearly 100 years of, we'll call it, traditional experience. Is that fair? That was all well and good, and it worked pretty well for them. They could mitigate their risks, and they could keep their risks at some tolerable level. Well, since it's changed in 10 years, and now more, it's hard to wrap our heads around it. So the key now is to try and understand, if I've got these athletes that are pitching so much and they're doing overload training, what are my risk factors here? And how do I possibly wrap some bound of, probability that they're going to get into the show and pay me back for my investment? That's really where we're at.
And let's go into overload training. What is overload training? It's loading the body to force an adaptation. That's as simple as we could say. But the problem is there are many ways we could do that. For example, in my approach, I like to load with medicine balls, 2 hands. I don't want it to isolate one joint. I want it to be multi-joint overloading. But unfortunately, trending today in the game, it's very common to overload 2 joints, elbow and shoulder. So talk about the complications. Well, ultimately, that's what you wanted to look into, because that's a trend now. We already have, we could say fairly, that there's a pattern of injury due to the skyrocketing injury rate as we change these pitchers to be more high-velocity guys. We have a pattern of injury in the shoulder and elbow. There's a good chance, there's a high probability, if you play this game long enough, you're going to have a shoulder-elbow injury. And then now we're trying to help improve the anaerobic athlete in the game. The trend is to overload the shoulder and elbow. Would that be an introduction to overload training right now?
Well, let me stay on this side of this for a second. So the doc that I'm working with 3 of them actually. One of them's out of U of M Hospital. She also serves on the Olympic Committee for Physicians. Here's what she told me. This makes a lot of sense. It's very clear. Look, we can get athletes running a mile that are phenomenal in terms of their speed and their athleticism and ability to run a very low time mile. But what we're doing more so today than we ever have is determining if that athlete should be doing that. Just because they can do it doesn't mean they should be doing that. There may be markers in that they put into their tests to determine if this is safe for them to be doing with their heart or their cardiac pulse, whatever. And they've actually changed athletes' directions based on, especially particularly like long distance runners, basketball players. We've seen basketball players drop dead on the floor, right? Mm-hmm. So just because they can run up and down the court, there may be something internal that says this isn't safe for you. It isn't a good idea. You're putting yourself at a great amount of risk doing this.
Right.
That we didn't measure before because we didn't know.
Right. Well,
right?
I just did that podcast with Dr. J about DNA, and the DNA tells you a lot about that. Are you actually built and engineered to be an aerobic athlete or an anaerobic athlete, or you're going to have your heart? How's your heart, your cardiovascular system going to support your training, stuff like that?
That's exactly right. So I've got Jim and Joe. Joe throws 98. Didn't need overload training. Didn't need hardly anything to get to that number. He naturally did it. Jim comes in and he's using a modified behavior program. Call it whatever you want. He inches his way up to 95 miles an hour. That's great. What we're reasonably assuming at this point, and we're beginning to wrap a strong bound of confidence around, is that when Jim comes in from modified behavioral training, throws 95, 98, he doesn't necessarily do it as long as Joe. Number one. Number two, his risk factors are, based on statistics, incredibly higher. Okay? So for us that are investing money into that person, we have to understand where he falls in this distribution. So we created a normal distribution, which has four quadrants, quartiles, right? So depending on how long he's thrown, how long he's trained in overload training, we can place him in that quartile with a proper Z-score and say, this is where he's at relative to a predictor of risk and sustained success. You follow? And that allows us to understand numerically, hey, this guy is low, medium, high risk. All right. And it's so far the model is working really well. And we're going to take it to another level.
So obviously you've been doing this with overload training, correct? You've been looking at this same model with overload training, those who do this form of training, what happens to the risk and what happens to their success over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that the overload training can, we'll say it pops. I'm using some of the vocabulary that I've seen. I don't get on Twitter too much.
It unleashes velocity.
Yeah. I mean, it pops these different muscle groups and flexations and internal rotation and
right, because unfortunately I think it falls, the overload training that's specifically on the shoulder and elbow, it falls into this misconception that enhancing the plyometric ability of the arm increases velocity. Yeah, it does, but is that the best way? And if you look at the kinetic chain, the efficiency of the kinetic chain, it really isn't the best way. Kibler and Chandler calculated that a 30% or a 20% decrease in the kinetic energy delivered from the hip and trunk to the arm requires a 34% increase of the rotational velocity of the shoulder to put the same force on the hand. So they're saying, if I'm decreasing the kinetic energy coming from the hip and trunk to the arm, I have to overcompensate by almost twice the amount, 20 to 34, just to keep the same force in the hand. So is it the best approach to train the arm to be a plyometric force generator? No, it's not. So unfortunately, I think overload training on the shoulder and arm, I mean, think about it, weight training is overload training, but overload training on the shoulder and the arm is an inefficient or a flawed approach just to start. And then not only that, you take approaches and camps that are doing it in an extreme level, and now they're falling into the data that you're finding.
So when parents ask me, should I do this? I quite honestly ask them, what are your goals? I mean, if your goals are just to have a lot of fun in high school and blow some people away for a X amount of years, hey, maybe it could work for you.
But what's X? You're right, but what's X?
It's a good question, Brent. I don't think we have enough data right now to say what X is, but we do know that comparatively, if I had two products to buy and I had Joe throwing 95 as easy and breezy as he can step up to the mound, that's a product I would want. If I had Jim coming in that had all this overload training to get there, and he showed me a track record of throwing 80, 83, and he plateaued at 83 for 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden took an overload training program and blew the doors off of his, we'll call it, the glass ceiling of his speed, I'm going to be suspect of that.
Let's talk more why, because I think that's a great thing we need to go into and talk about the approach specifically at Major League Baseball and how they run player development. But let's talk about the study and the work you've done as much as you can disclose. I know you have an NDA on your back, but talk about what you've seen as best you can when you get into some form of high intent overload training. What is happening to your body as opposed to just throwing a baseball?
Well, I think you know that when you start getting into overload training, you're breaking down mitochondria, you're breaking down tendons, you're stretching, you're flexing beyond what, God was meant for you to do in a sense. If I could throw that out there, I'm sure I'll get ridiculed for that. But I think that you've got a certain amount of fast and slow twitch muscles. And I'm not going to get into that science because that's not my background. But I think that you have a natural, innate body position and a position on a map. Overload training can take you past that position, but it does not come without a cost. And if anybody thinks it does, it's kind of like the movie I just watched this weekend, Concussion. God, that was a great movie with Will Smith, and talked about the CTE problem that has happened in the NFL. Nobody wanted to own up to it. Nobody wanted to look at it and dig into the science and wrap their head around it. Now almost every NFL player that's passing away is donating their brains to science because it's a real thing. I don't know. I don't think we're quite there yet with our arms and pitching, but I think the scenario is similar. People are not ready to be honest with ourselves. However, I will say this. I've seen the high schools now begin to implement a pitch count and strictly implement it, which is blowing me away. I think this happened in the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm thinking to myself,
unfortunately, which studies showed it doesn't even really work that well, pitch counts.
No, because you know why? They've got athletes that they generalize every athlete to be similar, and they're putting them on a 75 pitch count, and they give them 3 days to rest.
Where there's a DPT that I met I went to ASMI's baseball and injuries course, and he did studies on predictors of injury based on the increase in volume, and it was really, really strong. So basically he found, I think it was like up to 30% of an increase, your probability of injury started to really go up. So they were just basically saying it doesn't really matter how much you throw. If it's a big jump from your previous throwing outing, that's more the predictor to injury than how much you threw overall.
Quite possibly. Yeah, I haven't studied that. But I can tell you as a former pitcher that left his arm out on the field, if I got over 75 pitches and my arm started to hurt, I just kept going right through it.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I can't tell you how many pitchers I went full count on. So,
right.
The volume of pitching that I was doing in high school per game, a 7-inning game was ridiculous, I'm sure. It was in I'm sure I was throwing over 120 often in 7 innings.
So talk about the blood markers that you have looked at with the arm breaking down, specifically with the overload training that maybe can paint a picture of the kind of trauma that occurs between throwing a regular baseball to high intent overloading?
So there's just, there's a couple that are pretty obvious out there. You could Google them that are out there. These are markers that are for hormones that are released that can trace if you've damaged your muscles. It can't tell you quite how much, and it can't tell you anything about the past. It can only tell you what you did during that particular segment of time. But there's other measurements that I can't share with you that we can also do that are they're one-to-one. They're digital. They're like blueprinting your entire body, and they can show exactly what happened during that training. Those are pretty remarkable results when you get them. They show you exactly what this pitcher did and what that pitcher did, and the difference between the two of them is remarkable. And when you begin to look at that kind of data over test, retest, segment of time, I mean, the pilot study we just ran was over a 4-month period of time, and we had several measurements, and it was very convincing that the overload training, for sure, was putting a much higher load on the elbow and shoulder, and was breaking the tissue down to a much greater extent. And I'm going to put tissue out there because I don't want to say too much and then step on an NDA I'm standing on. So,
okay. So basically, you're saying that there's good evidence that there should be caution with an overload approach, specifically a high intent approach, because there's good evidence that you really can't get into that this is something that's not sustainable over a career.
I'm saying that if you compound these things, where you've got a 3 to 4 season pitcher, he's doing the high school season, he's doing 1 or 2 in the summer, he's doing 1 in the fall, he could be doing a winter season, and then you add overload training on top of it because you want to get through high school with your kid throwing 85, 88 miles an hour. I'm saying that if that's your goal, great. If your goal is to play until you're 30 or 40, you may want to reconsider how much of that you're doing. And you may want to consider the fact that a person coming into your life in the future that wants to offer you money is going to look at what you've done in your past. And he's going to try to draw a inference to how risky you are to put a lot of financial money into.
So it's kind of like with DNA. We can tell it's probably more in what we were talking about with Dr. J in the epigenetics that can show basically not how old you are. It's really a physical age of your body. So you could be 25, but you could have really abused yourself, and the DNA, it's probably the epigenetics profile would say your body's actually at an age of 45 due to the health, the current state of your body. You could put that probably on the arm and using some of these predictors by saying it's not really that you have so many bullets in your arm. It's just that your arm, you can age your arm a lot faster, meaning if we looked in the arm of, say, someone who's played all year round for 5 years and done a lot of heavy, high-intent overload training, we would look into that tissue and be like, man, this tissue looks 15 years older than the actual age of the person. Wouldn't that be correct?
Yeah. I mean, here's how we're going to approach this. For what I've done, we've got 4 docs on this. We're going to look at how you're responding to overload training, how your body's responding to different pitch counts at your velocities. We're going to run these tests and evaluations. As a group, we're going to say, hey, your body's responding well to this. you're doing fine, keep going, no problem. Or we're going to look at what the data is pouring out between blood work and the exoskeletal measurements, and we're going to say, hey, you've got a ton of edema. The edema is coming from what we're seeing here in the blood. So outside is the same as inside. We're seeing the same thing. You're not a guy that should be throwing 95 miles an hour, even though you can do it. It's tearing you apart. That's what we're trying to tell you. Does that make sense? It's not going to be just my opinion. It's not going to be just the final data analysis. It's going to be 4 research medical docs looking at it. And that includes a sports med person and an ortho.
And I think it's right. But what if I came along with my approach and I said, okay, what I like to do with my guys, because I went through that. I went through probably, I had the rotator cuff tear at 18, worked my way into indie ball at 26 once I got my body back. And by 28, 29, my arm was just shot, because what I had put it through after the rotator cuff tear just to get it back. But still, I don't think I should have been up there playing. The reason I was up there playing at 26 to 28 is because I took that Kibler and Chandler study and I took it to the max. I increased the energy coming up through my legs, so my arm was just a funnel. It was just regulating that. So if you have that guy, say in a major league organization, you said, okay, look, you throwing 95 is tearing you up. Is there any way I could come in and prove to you? I mean, obviously this would be a great study and say, okay, is it possible? Because I believe we can take that guy and get him to a healthier 95. Do you believe that that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, so there's different things. Well, let me go backwards to that rotator cuff. So, do you think that was, was that technique? Or do you think
surely. I had the worst mechanics I've ever seen. I did a show on it. It was garbage. And mainly because my hips are so tight. And there's studies that show a one-to-one relationship to your hip tightness to arm injury. So my hips weren't able to rotate, which screwed all my technique up. And then I cocked my arm extremely late. The torques that were hitting my arm were massive for the amount of speed I was throwing.
Yeah. So, to answer your question, there's different medicines that are legal that we could put an athlete on to reduce the swelling, and that could have a real dramatic effect on all those markers and be positive. And that would be good if it was minimized. But if we had to put them on a large regiment to make it happen so that they don't get a lot of, we'll call it disproportionate swelling, then all we're doing is band-aiding a real problem here. And the real problem is...
Are you promoting ice at this point? Are you saying ice is a good thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic all in itself right now. But, God, I've been watching that, but I don't step in it. But, so, the point is, are you designed to throw 95? Really? I mean, just because we develop some exercises and some training that has got you there, are you really designed to do it? And maybe that's not a question I need to be asking, but as a person hired by an MLB group, that's a question I need to answer for them. Is this person designed to be throwing this fast? Or are we looking at some artificial synapse that really shouldn't be there?
Well, I look at it this way. I mean, for example, I got like Cody Hall. He's 30 years old. He was a 100-mile-an-hour guy. Comes into my facility, can't break 89. He had some back issues. We cleaned that up, which that didn't allow him to really – that allowed – he didn't keep his legs strong because of the back issues. So his legs got weak, and his ball speed just started dropping. So I rebuilt his legs. I rebuilt what was working for him at 100 miles an hour, and the guy's back to, mid to upper 90s now. So I think there's many ways we can get guys to some of these speeds. It's just if it gets to the point, like to your argument, if it gets to the point to where we're having to tap into the arm, the ability for the arm to handle more stress, we're screwed. And I think that's where programs are flawed. They go right to the arm. They go, hey, let's get your velocity in the arm. And you're saying, man, you just shortened your shelf life considerably. And what I'm saying is, you're right. I would never do that because it didn't work for me. I would go elsewhere in the other joints of the body to maximize energy up the kinetic chain. And the last resort is going to the arm, because you're right. If we go to the arm, I have to shorten his shelf life to do it. And that's the problem, is the majority of kids out there today and the majority of now pro ball bringing in overload approaches are all they're doing is shortening the life of these pitchers up at that level that they're spending millions of dollars on.
And the interesting part is when I brought this up to some of those guys, they're like, show me the data. Well, I've got the data now, but I'm not sharing it with you because, quite honestly, I'm not giving it away. But the data does show that when we measured the body's reaction to that training, it wasn't favorable. How about let's say it that way? And we didn't just do it with, we'll call it exoskeletal studies. We did it with internal studies that were we're talking about nucleic, okay? These are right on, spot on. These are what surgeons are using to determine if they're going to do things in the brain, we'll call it. So these are very accurate measurements, and these are very reliable measurements. So, I think it's
yeah, I mean, the point is you're saying something to major league teams. They should hire you to do that same type of studies on their $1 million pitchers that they're running aimlessly through these overload approaches, because you might be considerably shortening their shelf life, and it takes time to get to Major League Baseball.
I would say that there'll be a day when what we're putting together here will be a common product for every MLB team. I would say that that's probably true. Yeah, because it's just it's such a I would say way to prevent unnecessary risk and a way to safeguard yourself as a business owner against investing into something that's going to fail.
Well, I think, Alex, this is where we have to work together, because you can't just tell a team or anyone, you can't just diagnose them. And in a way, you're diagnosing the problem, which is great. I mean, you got to start there, but you're right. They need an answer. And I think this goes back to what's gone on. So, going back to the 20-year mark when we said the pitchers, because we shortened their amount of pitches, they became more anaerobic, which then allowed them to throw harder. And now we have a lot of trauma, a pattern of injury due to the increase in velocity, because there's also direct correlation of velocity to arm injury. But the thing is I think baseball's known since the beginning of time that we play so many games that the only way these guys are going to survive and have a long shelf life, have a 20-year career like David Wells did, is if we teach them how to reduce their efforts. Baseball's doing that been forever. The traditional balance points, come to a balance point, slow your strides. I've seen that being coached all the way up at the major league level. So that's that at the major league level, they obviously know the answer. Even now that we've gone in the wrong direction, and you're proving that we've gone in the wrong direction with this overload trading, that is, we've got to create more low effort. We need to recruit more and develop more low effort pitchers. But the problem is you can't use the old tactics, the old strategies of balance points, slowing their strides, reducing their effort, because then you have a velocity problem, because that's where we're stuck. That doesn't work. So we have to come up with a better solution. And that's why I said I got to come into this, because using the kinetic chain, building it through the ground up, is going to allow them to increase the velocities or keep the velocities up without trashing the arms and shortening their lifespan.
And so, based on what you said, coming to the balance point, which is ironic because that was the first thing they taught me up at college.
Right, exactly.
But it's such a fact. But so some pitchers can. The problem that the bigger 30,000 foot problem here is that, darn it, some pitchers can make that work, right? And some pitchers have made that work and made a career out of it. So it flies in the face of better judgment. But the truth is, you come to that balance point and you spring out and try to get to that velocity you want to, and for many players, it's going to put an unnecessary loading somewhere and shorten the life of your pitching. So that's part of the problem here, really, is understanding that some pitchers can can get away with overload training, and they just have the body that can handle it. It appears some to a lot of pitchers cannot. I would say, purely guessing at this point, 2/3 of the athletes that are using it probably should not be. If they want to have a prolonged career in baseball till they're in their 30s as a professional, that would be my opinion from what I'm seeing. If they want to, and what I'm talking about here specifically is this, if they want to throw hard year round and do an overload training program, most of the athletes doing that are going to shorten their career significantly. That's what I'm seeing.
So what's going to change this trend? Like, what's going to change the trend all the way down to the low levels that, high intent weighted balls, overload training is not a good approach. It's a Hail Mary approach, and you're not going to get much life out of it. How do we trickle this down? How do we get this into baseball? I mean, to wake people up. Do these studies need to get out there? Because they don't really want to come out because we got all these NDAs on them. How do we get this information down there?
Those NDAs aren't going to last forever, Brent. I mean, but the point of it is that they invested in me, and so I'm sticking with my promise.
No,
but
I get it, yeah.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is that I think that people will begin to hear about other people using different techniques, and I think eventually you're going to see sports med people jump into this and say, hey, we're going to send you for some blood tests, and we're going to check for a couple markers here and see if this is occurring. We're going to check edema and see what's causing the edema, and we're going to figure out if you've got a unnecessary amount of edema or if you're normal in terms of what you're seeing in that elbow and that shoulder, and I think that's going to start occurring, because you should not engage a really good athlete or any athlete into one of these overload programs without keeping a close eye on things. And what I'm seeing is interesting is it's kind of like you buy the kit and you let your coaches at your facility just run it. Hey, let us know if you get a sore arm or sore shoulder. Well, guess what? It's too late. It's too late.
I know.
And so, I don't know. And the reason why I'm in it is because I'm passionate like you. My $1 million freaking Ireland set sail when my elbow cut loose, right?
Right, exactly.
So, and I don't want to see these kids. I see kids all the time being overpitched, and I have to walk away now because I've had some heated discussions with coaches that probably shouldn't be coaching. They didn't even have any knowledge of really how to protect a pitcher.
So what do these kids do that they have a coach in college or high school telling them they got to do these high intent weighted ball programs, and they're worried about their careers. They're worried that this is going to take years off their career, and they really don't want to do it. What do you tell those kids? Because you have all this evidence that says that it is. They're risking good years in their hopefully long career. What do you tell these kids?
It's interesting. Some of these guys that are doing it, they've done their own studies. They've done their own micro, what I'd call basic. So when you do, I actually teach research methods at the university. So I'm teaching that to a master's program right now. So there's a lot of different research you can do. One of them is exploratory research, which is just that. We're exploring. And so this type of research isn't bound by sample sizes and random control. It's more bound by just safe data and safe measurements. Well, what we're seeing come out of these, we'll call them overload training houses, is nothing but exploratory research. Now, here's the big danger. If you take exploratory research and then flash it to the public and say this is an experiment or research we ran, they take it and run with it as gospel that it can be generalized to the entire population. And that is the farthest thing from the truth, because there's no power to it. There's absolutely no precision to it. And the problem is that what they're doing maybe on the West Coast shows up in Indiana. And if I have a conversation with an athlete, I say, be careful. Oh, they got tons of research that says this is harmless. Let me see it. And it's got N of 7, N of 25,
which is
N
participants.
Of 30. I mean, it's
right. Well, unfortunately, they've taken the ASMI study, which is very exploratory on the torques and kinematic and kinetic parameters of 5, 6, 7, I think, ounces, or maybe it went to 9, and at the end, in the conclusion, ASMI says, may be beneficial, may be risky. And they grab the may be beneficial, and now they put it everywhere. Dr. Andrews says weighted balls are good for you. Seriously, this is how it goes off.
I saw that myself, and I think that's about the point I got off of Twitter.
Right. So I'm sitting here going, you know, I need to call up. I mean, I could get him on the line. I need to talk to Dr. Andrews and be like, can we do something about this? Because they're all taking it as you're a big proponent of high intent weighted balls.
Right. No, you are right on track with that. There isn't. I mean, I'll put my neck out here and say there isn't a good researcher that is going to say N of 25 or N of 50
is enough.
Can be generalized to the entire population.
Right.
Not when we've got hundreds of thousands of these athletes.
There isn't even really enough weighted ball studies on injury. I mean, we really just have one, and then yours, the one you've worked on, but we only have one public with Reinhold that Reinhold did, and it hasn't even finished, so it hasn't really been published. So we really don't have enough research on this to give a definitive answer. And for some reason, everyone's going to take this as a reason why they should do high intent weighted balls, but that should be a reason why not to, because there's enough empirical evidence showing that something's going on, and we need to figure this out.
Actually, I'll tell you, Brent. There's what we call file drawer research, which is where mine's at right now. And there's more than you think that has been done on weighted balls.
And you're right, and it's hidden. It's hidden.
Yeah. They're just not publishing it because people paid really good money for it.
And they don't want it out because it gives them an edge, right? Because, hey.
Yeah, potentially. It's not a very good game to play, is it?
Yeah, I mean, but that's really, baseball.
Yeah.
So the point is, I mean, you can say with confidence, you should definitely, should have a big cautionary tale on it when it comes to this form of overload training for player development, right? Yeah,
I mean, every parent needs to be able to, or professional athlete, is this the right thing for me? ? What are my goals? ? Because
I think everyone thinks it's just about the UCL. Well, I can blow it out 3 times. Look at Johnny Venters, you know.
You know what the number one tear is, I think, in softball is labrums.
Right, and those are killers, man. I don't know how you play again with a big labrum tear.
Yeah. I mean, so I was working with our softball players at the university to try and help them a little bit, their outfielders, with their mechanics so that they weren't loading so hard on it. But they're playing on such a short field, it's not like where we had the ability to run up a long way, do a pro step.
Everything's quick.
Right, and so they barely have enough time to even do a crow hop. But they have labrum tears, rotator cuff tears. We're suffering from rotator cuff and elbow, and so it's all the same. And then Tom had the right idea going into football players, you know, because they're any ball throwing athlete.
Well, look, really, you're bringing up Tom. Like, let's talk about this. Like, why did he, at the end of his career, push into weighted balls overload training?
That blew my mind, and I didn't stay that close to his story, but when I did read that, I was absolutely
me too.
I was shocked because for a person that was so fundamentally traditional, you know what I mean? I was surprised.
Well, he's been, give him credit, he's been doing it for a long time. I mean, obviously, do you think he's doing it a better way than most, or what?
I didn't look at. I would say that there's a high probability that he did it as cautiously as he possibly could. Because he was so about arm care, and he worked so closely with Nike Spark that it would surprise me that he may have done it at a really, really low rate to where he knew for sure he was safeguarded against any damage.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say anything on his approach. His approach is his approach, but just across the board, I mean, obviously people know I speak out against it, so you could definitely give a confident yes that this is some form of training you probably shouldn't do for the average baseball player, right?
I would say that if you've used long toss and you've used lower half training techniques and you've done everything possible to get your velocity up and it's still not happening, then there might be a reason for that.
But if you do go that route, there's a good chance you're shortening your career, right?
For sure. And so that's my whole point is, if you've done all these other things and you've built the foundation of having a high velocity arm action and it's just not happening, going into overload training could pop a lot of things and some may be negative.
Right.
And so I would say that not only, but the other part of it is this: if it's working for you, and you're doing that in conjunction with a 4-season year, ultimately you're reducing your marketability, in my opinion, from what I'm seeing, because there's no doubt we've only got so many tosses in our arms.
At the same time, too, teams are drafting you or bringing you in on potential. And if they hear that you've been doing a weighted ball program for 4 years and that's their player development, they're going to go, well, what can we get out of him? He's already been doing it for 4 years,
Well, yeah. So what used to be in the system was, hey, he's at, you're on a 6-year path, we'll call it, before you're ready to go up, right? So we're hoping you're going to develop and get to where we want you to be at within 6 years. And is that your understanding?
Yeah, definitely.
So so if you came to them with 4 years of it already, and you're throwing 89, 90, yeah, they're definitely going to ask themselves, what more can we give you? You're shooting nitrous into your arm now, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's where you got to be careful, because unfortunately, right now, it's going to be more common that a professional team to gain velocity is going to put you on a weighted ball program than do anything else with you. So if you're already going in and they know you're a big weighted ball guy, it's going to be a less attractive to them that they can get more potential out of you.
Well, and that's one thing. The other is going to be, what is your reliability as a product at this point? Because you've been playing 3-4 seasons and you're pushing an overload training program for 4 years. I'm going to worry as a team physician as to the health of your arm. And what do we know about Tommy John? I mean, you get Tommy John, I think, I don't know for sure, there's like a third fallout that don't quite come back to where they used to be. Isn't that correct? So
yeah, well, it's like 80% or 85% the first time, and then it drops to like 30-40% on the second Tommy John, and then there's only a few to even ever come back from 3. So
yeah, and so that's all factored into, the price they're going to put on you. So
it's like, and I'm just thinking, I'm looking at someone, I mean, I hate to call a name out, but like, Zach Britton, I've heard he's done weighted balls. He talks about him for a long time. Like, ever since that big injury he had a few years ago, once again, he's still, he's just threw the other day, first pin from rehabilitation surgery. He repaired that was the ruptured Achilles in his body. So, okay, it wasn't related to his arm, but that needs to be done. Like, we need to look at now, I think we have enough evidence to look at these pro guys that have been using weighted balls for a good amount of years now, and let's see the injury rates coming out of that. Wouldn't that be a good study?
Well, what would be interesting is to mark those guys and see what their pitch counts are, and then also take a good look at what they're doing every day to try and keep their pitch counts up. Because you can work harder and harder at keeping your pitch counts up, because we know that's related to your anaerobics, right?
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to track those guys. Yeah, I agree with that. That's something I haven't done. I've never been invited in to do that before.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think what we're finding is it's more, this data is being collected, and in the next 10 years, we're going to know a lot more about what we've been doing to ourselves and how we've trained in player development in baseball than we do now, and there's going to be a lot more. I think it's not something you want to get to in 10 years and then realize, wow, for the past 10 years I went the complete wrong way for a player or an organization. So I think there's enough evidence now to start making a good or getting a good big picture on what's going on to where you can start making some smarter choices in player development, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to common sense. I mean, you've got to give that arm a lot of rest, as with any part of your body. You ever look at this thing they call pitcher droop?
No.
When you look in the mirror? So you pitched for quite a few years,
like
right?
The throwing arm, yeah. But I had a chromioplasty. They shaved the chromium tip off, so my arm naturally now is going to hang lower.
Oh, so that's a little different. All right. But for me, I didn't have surgery on my shoulder or elbow. But if I stand in front of the mirror, I'm lopsided. Every person that's ever seen me with my shirt off is like, what happened? I mean, that's the physical change that takes place for throwing all those years.
What's called a sulcus sign, I believe. It's how far your clavicle is sticking above your shoulder. And it's very common in pitchers. And you're right. And it links to evidence that throwing over time weakens the arm, and people don't understand that. I mean,
you see where I'm going with that, though?
Yeah.
So, that's another evidential piece that says there's long-term effects to throwing. And so, I think the bottom line here is, hey.
No, what's crazy is there was a study they did that pitchers, I think in high school, the average pitcher in high school had a weaker throwing shoulder than the general public.
Really?
Yeah, I found that study.
That's really remarkable. I never heard that.
Right. Well, that's why, it just plays into my narrative that you can't build velocity or a career off just throwing. It doesn't work that way.
No, you've got to use those big, big muscles to give you.
And you got to rebuild. You got to rebuild. And that's the thing is, I think the misconception, a lot of the weighted ball camps said, hey, overload training with baseball or weighted ball is weight training for the arm. That's BS. It's completely different. The valgus stress is a lot more traumatic to the body than a flexion extension stress. It's different.
Totally. Yeah. All right. Well,
that was good, man.
I've got some students I got to get to.
I know you do. Well, I really appreciate it. Any last words on this, and I'll close it out?
Yeah, sure. I think that what you're doing with your research with the biomechanics is priceless.
Appreciate it.
I think that if I had that back in the day, God knows what could have happened and changed. People that are wishing their way into high velocity, I wish them the best of luck, and I know exactly what you're trying to do. I was a lefty, a pure lefty that barely got to 85. Believe me, if I could have mowed grass my way into or crawled on glass to get to 90, I would have. Right. But it wasn't in the cards, and it wasn't part of God's gifts for me. So be careful, because everything comes at a cost.
Yeah.
And I think we're definitely showing that now. And the other thing, parting note, watch that movie Concussion, Brent.
Okay. Because
it'll help set your framework for your mission. It will.
Perfect. I will. Good call. All right. Let me end this right now. Here we go. Well, I don't know about you guys, but tonight I'm going to watch the Concussion movie on football because I think Dr. Manga's nailed it. There really is a strong comparison between the two. The kind of trauma it does to a career, does to a person's health. I know it's a lot worse with the brain. But it's the same when it comes to the lifespan of a career. And that's the sad part here. And that's what my goal in this is to really protect the kids that are being subjected to this ignorantly without knowledge of the risks behind it. That's all I'm trying to do, is put the risks behind it out there, and hopefully those getting involved can make a better, more educated decision. Dr. Manga is looking at more from a business perspective with teams, that he can help them understand, is this a good risk return, or are they going to get a good return based on the risk? So two different perspectives here, but I think it painted a good picture for you to understand what you're up against with this form of training. So really enjoyed the podcast. Please subscribe, follow us, and stay tuned for our next one. Hopefully they just keep getting better. So we'll see you next time.